that your cameras and your microphones are off. That will help with the presentation. So hopefully with a bit of luck, we'll see this, and I'll be back in about half an hour.
Hi there, and welcome to this presentation about Operation Wallaceia's school expeditions to Honduras. My name is Dr. Dan Exton. I'm Head of Research at Operation Wallacea, and I've been involved with the organisation since 2005, first as a student, then as a PhD student, and then as a full-time staff member for the last 10 years or so. I've also spent the last 10 years running the Marine Research Programme out in Honduras. I've spent a lot of time in the country, so it's somewhere that I know a lot about, I have a lot of experience in, and so hopefully I can give you a good insight into what the expedition would involve. I'm just going to start with a quick introduction to us as an organisation. Now, Operation Wallacea, or OPWAL for short, have been running expeditions since 1995, and during that time we've worked in 19 different countries around the world. And the idea of our expeditions is to bring together students and professional scientists in order to achieve real international quality research. And so over the past 25 odd years, we've been very successful in this. We've discovered 60 new species to science, including quite a few vertebrates, which are fairly unusual these days. And we've also managed to publish over 550 scientific publications, which is the equivalent of a small university department, really. Now, every summer we have around 3,000 students joining us on expedition, and those students join us for a whole range of reasons. Some join us because they have a passion and an interest for wildlife and conservation. Others join us because they're thinking of science as something to study at university or for a career afterwards. Others join us because they want to get their hands dirty and take part in real research and help to collect real data. And others join because they have a passion for travel and experiencing new places and new cultures. But whatever the reason might be, it's the participation of students like yourselves that drive the entire programme, because by having you there on site, that allows us to bring out our teams of scientists, our academic collaborators, and that then allows them to get to work studying these highly threatened ecosystems. At the same time, those scientists have access to your wonderful manpower, which allows them to collect massively more data than they otherwise would be able to. And this programme then allows us to generate enormous amounts of data, which go toward publications, but also go towards working out how best to protect these ecosystems. Because unfortunately, every ecosystem we work in is threatened in one way or another. And one of our main aims at all of our sites is to try and think of ways to work with the local communities to protect and look after those ecosystems for the long term. So these are the areas that we work in around the world now, and you'll see our clusters of sites in the Indo-Pacific, Southern Africa, Europe, and then Central South America and the Caribbean. And having these clusters of sites allows us to do really cool comparisons between these different places. But for today's talk, I'll be focusing on Honduras. And for those of you who don't know where Honduras is, and I didn't before I started working there, I'll be honest, it's the light green dot over to the western end of this map. So just to the southeast of Mexico. Now, wherever you're coming from in the world, you will almost certainly fly into Honduras via the United States or via Mexico City. They tend to be the two major flight routes in and out of Honduras, although there are a couple of others that always emerge. So don't be surprised if you end up transiting somewhere very, very random, but you'll arrive in Honduras all the same, be met at the airport, and your expedition will then begin. If we zoom into Honduras, you'll see that the country is wedged between El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala and Belize. It's in that Central American belt of countries, and you will fly into a city called San Pedro Sula, which isn't the capital. The capital is called Tegucigalpa down in the south, which is nowhere near the places we work and has a horrendously tricky airport to land and take off in, so we avoid Tegucigalpa at all costs and fly into San Pedro instead. You'll be met at the airport, whisked off on expedition, and you'll spend 2 weeks with us in the country. Your first week will be spent just to the west of San Pedro Sula. You'll see there the Casuco National Park, and you'll spend that week up in the cloud forests, up in the mountains, learning about cloud forest conservation and ecology. You'll then travel down through the country along the coast to the town of La Ceiba, and from there you'll take a ferry out to one of the islands, Utila or Roatan, to spend a week with my team of marine biologists, learning about coral reef conservation and ecology. So why are we interested in Honduras? Well, Casuco National Park, the place you'll spend your first week, has been listed as one of the top 50 most irreplaceable places in the world, which is pretty incredible. And most of the data that went towards that has come from our scientists and our students over the last 15 years. So it's an incredibly important place, but it's also incredibly threatened for a few different reasons. First of all, over 50% of Hondurans live below the poverty line. And where you find high poverty, you almost always find high reliance on natural resources, which leads to deforestation, which leads to excessive hunting and things like that. Now, it's easy for us to sit here in the West and say that those are terrible things to do, but these people aren't doing it through choice. They're almost all doing it through desperation. And so a big part of what we do is trying to bring new income streams into these communities to pull them out of poverty, to stop them having to rely on these damaging activities. Now, they're also home in Honduras to spectacular Caribbean coral reefs, which you'll spend your second week working on. And also Honduras is very, very famous for being the most mountainous country in Central America. And you will learn that the hard way in your first week, because you'll be up in the mountains, trekking up and down and up and down. But this is another reason why Casuco National Park is both irreplaceable and threatened, because where you find lots of mountains in the tropics, you find lots of very unique ecosystems called cloud forests. You can see the photo on the left-hand side there, a jungle up in the clouds. And what essentially happens is the top of every mountain becomes a little island of cloud forest, and climate change is squeezing that cloud forest up and up and up and up and up, which makes it cover a smaller and smaller area, which makes it more and more rare and therefore more and more threatened. So those are some of the key reasons we work in Honduras. In terms of our research objectives and what we're hoping to achieve, in the forest we're monitoring key indicator groups of animals and plants, things that give us an early warning system as to what's happening in those forests. And then we're using that data to plan conservation practices, essentially. What's the best way to protect those forests? And the data you help us collect will go towards those two objectives. Now, in the longer term, we want to use our data to apply for something called a REDD+ application. This is basically a large-scale carbon offsetting program, where if you can prove how much carbon your forest is storing, and also how much biodiversity it contains and how threatened that biodiversity is. So in the case of Casuco, lots of carbon, lots of biodiversity, very threatened. You can apply for funding via the REDD+ scheme, which is where governments offset their carbon emissions by protecting areas of tropical rainforest. It's a very, very big piece of work that we've been working on for a very long time now. And in the long term, that would allow the communities within Casuco National Park to completely revolutionize the way they interact with the forest. We also want to encourage year-round tourism to the park, because as you'll see, it's a beautiful place, but very, very difficult to get to. And other than the Operation Wallacea groups, it's almost impossible to get there as a tourist. And we want to try and change that, because tourism is a great source of income for local communities to improve their own income streams. Down on the marine site, we've got two main objectives. Number one, we're very heavily involved in developing new technologies that can help us study coral reefs and conserve coral reefs in much more efficiently. So you'll learn about these new technologies while you're down there. And we're also collecting long-term data sets to look at how those coral reefs are changing, as well as studying particular groups of organisms that live on those coral reefs and how we can help to conserve them specifically. Now, if we zoom in on our map, you'll see Casuco National Park there in the little box. And we work right across the park. So our aim is to collect data that gives us as accurate an impression as possible of the whole Casuco National Park. Now, it's a fairly large area, so you're not going to be able to cover it all in just 2 weeks. So we have a network of camps that are dotted around Casuco National Park, and you will visit 2 of those camps during your 2 weeks. In terms of what you'll be doing in your first week, there will be a whole range of surveys taking place, studying different aspects of the wildlife there, and you will rotate between them all. So you'll have the opportunity to experience all the different surveys that are taking place. And your work or the week will be split between 2 different camps. One will be what's called our base camp, our luxury camp in inverted commas, and one is in the core zone of the park, which is much more basic, but gives you the opportunity to see the real pristine jungle up in Kasuko. You'll have the opportunity to attend lectures and workshops run by our various scientists to learn about the animals and the plants that you'll be seeing and studying while you're up there. And you'll also have the chance to attend practicals to learn how to actually handle these animals and how to collect data from them. The idea is to send you home as experienced field scientists, and that's really what we're looking to achieve. You'll also learn what makes research and conservation important, why we're interested in Kasuko National Park, and what the data you helped us to collect will be used for. Right? And I personally think that's a really important part of the trip. You know, we want your manpower to help us to collect data, but we want you to understand the importance of what you're doing. You'll also develop a whole range of new skills that will be really useful for your schoolwork. And if you're going on to study biology at university, then really, really important for that too. And a very underrated benefit of these expeditions, in my opinion, is the opportunity to meet other students, because the chances are you won't be the only school group there at that same time. There will almost certainly be school groups from other parts of the world. So there may be school groups from the UK, from Europe, from Canada, the US, from Central or South America, from all sorts of places, Canada and so Australia and New Zealand maybe. So it's the opportunity to spend time with people from other cultures, as well as spending time with our Honduran staff to get a feel for what life is like living in Honduras, and also all of our university students and our staff who tend to be early career scientists, PhD students. So if you're thinking of science as a career, it's a really, really great opportunity to meet people who are a few years ahead of you to get a feel for what life is like if you chose that path. Now, if we zoom into our map of Kasuko again, we can see the camps in a little bit more detail, and each of the camps is structured in exactly the same way. So at each camp, we have 4 transects running from them, each 2 kilometers long. So those orange lines you can see on the map there are these 2 kilometer long transects. And then our data is collected along all of those 4 transects, the same transects every single year, year after year after year, which gives us great consistency in our data. Along each of those transects, there are 5 habitat plots, which are 20 by 20 meter plots, which again, we go back and study year after year to see what trees are there, whether there's been evidence of deforestation, how those trees are growing. And then along the transects themselves, we can monitor the animals that are moving around, the large mammals, the small mammals, the herpetofauna, and things like that. So by working along these transects and in these habitat plots, it means our data is comparable year after year, which allows us to, in really high detail, work out what's changing in these forests, what the major threats are, and try to work out what to do about that. Now, there are a huge number of different activities you'll be rotating between while you're there in Kasuko. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the key ones. Now, when you first arrive, I'm assuming most of you have never visited a jungle before, and probably almost certainly have never lived in the jungle for a week. So one of the first things we'll do with you is what's called a jungle skills course. We used to call it jungle survival, but that sounds a bit more extreme than it actually is. Now, this is a course run by some of our local guides who have lived in the jungle all of their lives, just to get you familiar with how to work and live safely in the jungle, how to look for clean drinking water, how to build shelters, the kind of, Bear Grylls survival stuff. There will also be the chance to do a short course on something called Canopy Access. This is an external company to Opwall that helps people get up into the canopy, about 30 or 40 meters up into the trees. They've worked with cameramen for the BBC, and they've worked with our scientists. Now, if you want to, you can book a half-day course to learn how to access the canopy. There is an extra cost for that. You can book it in advance, and that cost goes to the Canopy Access team for running the course for you, but just to make you aware that it's an option. You'll then complete one of our tropical forest ecology courses. This is a series of lectures and practicals, which is designed to give you the theoretical knowledge you need to go out there and collect useful data and to understand what you're doing. So you might have a lecture on birds and then go out with one of our ornithologists to help them collect data on those birds. Then there'll be a whole series of different survey types that you will spend time on during the week. One of those will be our large mammal surveys. Obviously, we're interested in how biodiversity is changing, and things like illegal hunting is a big problem in places like Kasuko. So monitoring how the mammal populations are changing over time is a really important part of what we do. Now, this is done using things like camera traps, which take photos of things every time something walks in front of the camera. It can also be walking along the transects looking for evidence of these mammals, and similarly using traps to study the small mammal populations. Then you'll spend some time studying the birds. Now, birds are a fantastic indicator group because they can just get up and fly away if there's too much disturbance happening in a forest. So we tend to study birds quite heavily at all of our sites. There are two ways we study birds, and you'll get the chance to experience both of them. One is point counts, where you stand on the spot for a certain period of time with a pair of binoculars and you note down every bird that you see. That's a great method for studying birds that live higher up in the canopy, things like your toucans. And then there's mist netting, which is where you set up a net lower down underneath the canopy. Birds fly into the net and are caught in these little pouches, totally unharmed. And then we will teach you how to remove those birds, handle them safely so you're not hurting the birds. And that gives you the bonus of being able to measure them, weigh them and tag them. So mist netting is a much more accurate way of doing it. But for birds that fly high up in the sky, you've got no chance of catching them in a net, so that's where we use the point counts. We've also for a very long time studied dung beetles, and dung beetles, not only do they look pretty cool, but they're also a really important group in the forest because they help to cycle the detritus and the kind of mud and the muck that settles onto the floor and turn it into valuable nutrients for the plants to absorb. So a really important part of the community, and you'll spend some time studying those. Then a very big part of what we do in Kasuko is looking at the herpetofauna. So these are snakes, lizards and amphibians, because quite a few of the new species we've discovered in Kasuko over the past 15 years have been members of the herpetofauna. So we focus quite a lot of our research on this group. Now, there are lots of different ways of studying herpetofauna. One of the coolest ways of doing it is to go out at night along the transects, something called a spotlight survey, because you'll go during the day and you'll look around and you won't see very much at all. And then you go back at night and you turn on your torch and you'll be able to see the reflections in the eyes of all the animals that are looking back at you. And it's incredible just how much is really there, but it's so well camouflaged and so well hidden that you'll struggle to see it during the day, but we'll see it much better at night. Now, there are some venomous snakes in Kasuko, so we have a very strict rule of no handling snakes unless one of our snake experts catches a non-venomous species, and then we'll give you the opportunity to handle it if you want to. But the rule is don't just go picking up random snakes. I'm sure you wouldn't dream of doing that anyway. And we'll also see a lot of really cool amphibians in the park, and we've done quite a lot of research over the years on how those amphibians are being impacted by a fungal infection called chytrid, which is wiping amphibians out right around the world. You'll then spend some time light trapping. So this is done at night as well, and this is to focus on the moths and the other insects that fly around at night. So just like the name suggests, this is where you set up a very bright light surrounded by a kind of mosquito net, and all the different animals are attracted to that light, and you catch them within the mosquito net, and you'll see some incredible species, moths as big as your face, some really cool looking ones. Another project done at night will be bats. And we study bats in the same way as birds using the mist nets. The only difference being that we won't allow you to handle the bats directly. And that's only because bats can sometimes carry rabies and they're very nippy little so-and-sos. So, we don't want you guys getting bitten by them. Our bat scientists will take the risk and take the chance. But you'll be able to see them up close and personal. And there are some really weird and wonderful, wacky looking bat species that live up in Kasuko. Now, underpinning all of the research we do really are the habitat surveys, because if you want to understand what's happening in a forest, you can't ignore the trees. The trees are the kind of basis of the entire ecosystem. They're the basis of the food web. They provide the 3D structure that provides habitats for different species to live in. So a big part of what we do is also going out and looking at the habitat structure, the forest structure that's out there. That also allows us to go away and calculate how much carbon is being stored in the forest, which will be a crucial part of our RED+ application for carbon offset funding. Then when we look at your accommodation, like I said, you'll spend time within two different camps. The photo on the right-hand side is our base camp, and the top left-hand corner shows the shower block there. So this is what we call our civilized, our luxury camp. And you know, for a jungle site, this is pretty luxurious. The one thing to watch out for is those showers are brutally cold, because you're up at about 2,000 meters altitude, and so the water is basically a mountain stream that's been redirected to your showers, and so it's icy cold mountain water. So if you want to wake up in the mornings, there's no better way than jumping in those showers. The other half of your week will be spent in a much more basic jungle camp, like you can see in the bottom left-hand photo here. So this will be sleeping in hammocks, tied up between two trees with a big waterproof cover over the top of it. When you're in base camp, you'll be staying in tents that are raised off the ground on wooden platforms, so that when it rains, you don't get swept away by the monstrous rain storms that we get sometimes. So at the end of your first week, you'll travel through Honduras down to one of our marine sites, and you'll go to one or the other of Roatan or Utila. What you'll be doing and what the facilities are like are exactly the same between the two, but we just split our groups between the two so we can cover more locations. Now, your second week is much more training focused rather than helping us to collect data. And this is simply because collecting data underwater is very challenging, and you've got to be very competent at scuba diving or snorkeling before you can even think about collecting useful data. So rather than add that pressure to you and expect you to collect useful data, we focus much more on the training this week. So you will do one of two things. If you would like to learn to scuba dive and you can't already scuba dive, then we will teach you to scuba dive, and you'll spend the week completing an internationally recognized scuba diving qualification called the PADI Open Water Course. This will be a series of theory lessons in the classroom, confined water sessions learning how the equipment works in the shallows, kneeling down on the bottom, and then scuba diving out on the coral reefs to put those skills into practice. Now, for those of you who can already scuba dive and are already qualified, or you don't want to scuba dive, or you're not able to scuba dive for medical reasons, for example, then you will complete a Caribbean coral reef ecology course. So this is a series of lectures to learn about coral reefs and the species that live there and how we study them, followed by a whole series of practicals that will be done by diving, if you're a qualified diver, or by snorkeling, if you're not a qualified diver. So again, this is a great way to learn about the research that we're doing there and get in the water on these coral reefs. You'll also get a lot of exposure to the types of projects that we're running out there. So for example, we have a big project running studying a particular species of sea urchin. I always describe it as trying to solve a murder mystery, because this urchin was incredibly common in the Caribbean up until the mid-1980s, when it was almost wiped out from the face of the earth by a disease. And we still don't know where this disease came from. And 40 years later, this species has still not recovered. And it's one of the main reasons why Caribbean coral reefs have been deteriorating over the past 40 years. So we're trying to study this species, what's left of it, to try and understand whether there's any way of recovering the population artificially. We've also been very successful in Honduras at having a new marine protected area set up. So quite a lot of the work we do now is studying this marine protected area to see whether there's any evidence of it being successful, and trying to think of ways of improving the way that marine protected area is managed. We also do a lot of work on lionfish, which are an invasive species to the Caribbean. So this is a really voracious predator that's naturally found on coral reefs in Southeast Asia and East Africa, and was introduced by accident to the Caribbean, again back in the mid-1980s. It was a bad period for Caribbean coral reefs. The two aren't related, I promise. And we do a lot of work trying to understand how best to control this invasive species. What can we do about them? And also trying to understand their ecology, how they're interacting with these new environments that they're invading. At the same time, like I mentioned at the start, a big focus of our work in Honduras is developing and implementing new technologies for ways of studying coral reefs in better accuracy. So this is things like building 3D models of coral reefs, filming areas of reef, and then turning that video footage into an interactive 3D model, so you can then study that coral reef from a computer later on. And also stereo video surveys, which is what the photo here is showing, which is where you use two video cameras that work essentially like a pair of human eyes. The reason we can see in 3 dimensions and judge distances is because we've got two eyes on the front of our head. Now, if you mimic that with cameras and have two cameras mounted, you know exactly the distance between them and the angle between them, then you can not only film the reef to count how many fish are there, you can measure the size of every fish to get an idea of biomass, which is super important for studying coral reef fisheries. And then what we're aiming to do on site is to bring all of these different technologies together into a brand new integrated coral reef surveying method, which will be a kind of new method for surveying coral reefs into the future. So that's where we use benthic video surveys to study the health of the reef. We combine that with our 3D modelling, which allows us to study 3D structural complexity of the reef. On top of that, we can geo-reference the position of things like our little sea urchin friend that we're studying. And on top of that, we can overlay our stereo video surveys, which let us look at fish abundance, fish biomass, and fish biodiversity. So you pull them all together to create an entirely new way of studying coral reefs. Now, the accommodation at the marine sites is pretty similar between the two locations. On Utila, we stay at this place here, which is called the Coral Reef Research Centre, and you'll be staying in dormitory rooms. There are normally 4 to 6 students per room in bunk beds. Each room has an ensuite bathroom, so after your week in Kasuko, this will feel like absolute luxury. You know, running water, showers, flushing toilets, and air conditioning at night, because you know you're on a Caribbean island in the summer. It will be brutally hot and almost impossible to sleep without air conditioning. So we do allow air conditioning to be turned on, but only at night. Now, because your first week will be spent trekking up in the mountains of Kasuko National Park, Honduras is one of our most demanding expeditions from a fitness perspective. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be an Olympic athlete or a marathon runner. It just means that a little bit of fitness will help you enjoy the trip as much as possible and get the most out of it. So it's a perfect opportunity to go out and work on your fitness. There's a long time before the expedition is due to happen. So if you feel like your fitness could be a little bit better, then use this as a great excuse to improve it. Down at the marine site, in order to be able to qualify as a scuba diver, you need to swim 200 meters unaided without touching the bottom, and you need to be able to tread water for 10 minutes, again, without a flotation device, unaided. So if you feel like your swimming isn't quite up to that level yet, again, there's plenty of time to get down to your local pool and get some practice in before the trip happens. Now, parents in particular will have been watching this talk thinking there seem to be quite a few risks out there in Honduras. And of course, you know, there's nothing in life that's completely risk-free, but it's our job to make sure that your expeditions run as risk-free as possible. And to be honest, we are incredibly proud of our health and safety record, and that's not through luck. That's because we spend far more time planning our health and safety and worrying about the safety of our expeditions than we do on the research and the conservation side of things, because we are well aware that our entire reputation is based on the fact that we are able to keep students nice and safe while on expedition. And there are lots of ways that we do that. You can find a lot more information on this on our website if you're interested, but to run through some of them quickly, we put a lot of focus on training of students, but also training our staff who are running the expeditions for us. We carry out very extensive risk assessments, which you can read online if you're interested, and we audit the sites regularly to make sure that they are meeting the criteria set out in those risk assessments. We provide medical insurance to all of our participants so that no matter what happens, we're able to provide the medical and evacuation cover that someone needs. Now, obviously, our priority is avoiding things happening in the first place, but with 3,000 students on our expeditions every summer, trekking in rainforests and scuba diving on coral reefs, it's inevitable that there will be a few minor injuries and minor illnesses. And so having that insurance cover gives us peace of mind that we can get the care that we need if and when we need it. We also fly doctors and nurses and paramedics, normally from the UK, but sometimes from elsewhere, out to Honduras every summer. There are normally a few based up in Kasuko and one based down on in the marine sites to provide that on-site medical care, which is a great extra support. Communications wise, we're always in communication with the outside world, but just be aware that you may not be, particularly when you're in Kasuko for your first week. There's no phone signal, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no 3G, there's no internet. So you essentially just switch your phone off when you arrive in Honduras. My advice would be don't turn it back on until you fly back out 2 weeks later. But when you come to the marine site, there will be some opportunity to get online, but it will be slow. You're in the tropics and it may break for a few days. So I would normally just tell friends and family to assume they won't hear from you. But when it comes to health and safety, we're in constant contact with the outside world using radios and satellite phones and Honduras SIM cards and things like that. Now, we're completely compliant with government safety standards. In the UK, that's BSA Tech 48, for example. Again, you can read the document about that for Honduras on our website. And if you're curious to see what our medical record is really like for Honduras, we publish that data on our website every year. And what you'll see is the number of incidents is incredibly low, number one, based on the number of people we have. And number two, the vast majority of the incidents are incredibly minor. They're a little bit of sunburn, they're mild dehydration because people haven't been drinking enough. They're people who've been scratching their mosquito bites and they've got slightly infected, little things like that. And anything more serious than that is incredibly rare. Now, a couple of other things to note: if any of you have allergies, there aren't really any allergies we can't handle on site. We've pretty much handled all of them over the years, but the more time we have to plan for them, the better. So if you have an allergy, please let us know nice and soon so we can make any required changes to the program. And when it comes to diving, there are certain medical conditions, such as some types of asthma, which might require you to get an extra medical checkup before you're allowed to scuba dive. Those are not our rules. Those are the globally recognized medical rules for scuba diving. We only want to make sure that you are not putting yourself at elevated risk by scuba diving. So we may well ask you to go and get some extra medical checks. We send the medical forms out to you nice and early. Fill them in as early as you can. That gives you plenty of time to get any extra checks that you need without any last-minute rushes. Now, we also want you to use these expeditions for educational purposes. So there are lots of ways that students have done that in the past. If there's a way that you can think of where you would benefit in some way from using some of our data, interviewing some of our scientists, whatever it might be, chat to your teachers, number one, to see whether it genuinely fits within your studies. And then feel free to reach out to us, have a look on our website or email us. We're always happy to have a chat about options. It might be that we can't help in certain circumstances, but that's very, very rare. Normally there's some way we can find to help you out and support you through whatever piece of work it is you're doing. Now, there are a few costs to be aware of when it comes to the expedition. There's a fixed cost to Operation Wallacea, which pays for the 2 weeks you're with us on site. That's food, accommodation, medical insurance, equipment, training, scuba diving, all that sort of thing. And then the other big cost is travel, of getting to and from the expedition site. And obviously, depending on where you're coming from in the world, the overall price will be significantly different. So at the end of this presentation, you'll be told what price to expect for this 2-week expedition. Now, if you decide to join up, then you'll be asked to pay an initial deposit to Operation Wallacea, and beyond that, you can pay the rest in instalments or as monthly payments, depending on what you and the school prefer. There is a specific costing sheet that you'll be provided with that breaks down the cost in terms of what it's going towards and some of the smaller other costs that you can expect, things like vaccinations, a little bit of equipment, and that sort of thing. Now, the majority of our students are not in a position to pay for these expeditions outright. It is a lot of money to come up with. And so most of our students rely on fundraising for some or all of the cost of these expeditions. And in my opinion, fundraising should be a big part of the process. It's a great thing to add to your CV. And there aren't many careers nowadays that don't involve some sort of grant writing, fundraising, sales and marketing. And so this is a great opportunity to develop and showcase those skills. Now, we obviously can't do the fundraising for you, but what we can do is give you lots of advice and support on great ways of raising the money. And we have a whole team of people at Opwall who specialise in fundraising, have fundraised for their own expeditions in the past, and are here to give you inspiration and help set you on the right path with your fundraising. So it's something that whatever position you find yourself in, I would strongly recommend at least trying to do a little bit of fundraising. And of course, if you're in a position where you need to do a lot of fundraising, then make the most of the resources we have here at Opwall to help you in your efforts. A final thing to mention is that we're very conscious of the fact that our whole operation relies on flying teams of students and scientists around the world, and that involves a lot of long-haul flights. Now, obviously, the work we're doing in these countries is massively beneficial to preventing biodiversity loss and also slowing down climate change, but I'm a big believer in people can always do more. And so a few years ago, we set up a flight offsetting program based at our Indonesia site, but students can offset their carbon emissions from whichever expedition site they're flying out to. What we would ask you to do, and this is totally voluntary, is to donate $10 per tonne of carbon that your flights will emit to our partner charity, the Wallacea Trust. and that money will go towards tree planting efforts in Indonesia. So the money goes and pays local communities that we work with to first of all collect seeds and seedlings from the forests, to grow those seedlings up in small nurseries, and then to plant those trees out when they get to about 0.5 to 1 meters in height. And then over time, that's going to help to reverse the effects of deforestation. It will create new habitat for the species that are threatened in the area, and it will also help to suck in carbon dioxide and start to fight back against climate change. So we feel very passionately about this project, and I hope it's something you'll all be willing to support closer to the expedition date, but just so it's on your radar and it's not a complete surprise when you find out about it in your inbox. So that's everything for this talk. I hope you found it interesting. It's been a bit of a whirlwind tour, giving you a bit of an idea of what your expedition to Honduras would look like. If you'd like to find out more about us as an organisation, some of our projects, some of our conservation work, the communities we work in, or Honduras more specifically, then have a look on our website, or you can follow us on social media. Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter posts are there. I'm now going to hand over to a bit of a Q&A session. And obviously, if you do have any questions further down the line, feel free to jump online, and there's an online chat function and an email address you can use to contact us as well. So thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing some of you at least out in Honduras in the future.
Okay, thanks very much for watching through the presentation. I've now got just a couple of bits and pieces that I want to go through regarding the next steps for the expedition. So the trip is planned for 2025, and it's running between the 2nd of July and the 15th of July. But once we account in travel time, you'll probably be leaving around about the 30th of June, and then you'll be back by round about the 17th of July. So if anybody is planning family holidays, we have estimated it to be between sort of 4,100 and 4,300. That's we think it will probably sort of come in round about this sort of 3,700, 3,800 mark, but that is dependent on what we can get the flights for, and also how many people come. So we've added a contingency on there. The other thing that I just wanted to clarify, that I noticed that Dan talked about insurance. You will need your own travel insurance when you come, and that will cover things like your medical and repatriation, and it will also cover your pre-trip, any pre-trip cancellations, plus any travel disruption or lost baggage. Now, in terms of sign up, as I understand it, there will be a letter sent out tomorrow, which will give you details on how to pay your deposits. But I will pass over now to Sandra, who will be able to explain that a whole lot better than I can.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Yes, I will be sending a letter out tomorrow. Hopefully it'll go tomorrow, and it will explain the cost breakdown, as Helen has just mentioned. And in addition to that, how many students we can take and what you need to do in order to register your interest for this trip. And then I should hopefully have everything back and let you know before we go off on school holidays of who is going to be coming on the Honduras expedition. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask either myself about the trip and from a JCG perspective, or Helen from an UPWAL?
If your microphone doesn't work, you can type your question into the chat, and we'll answer that. I'm just thinking of common questions I get asked. The first one that I normally get asked is about PADI and the forms that people need to fill out. So when you go diving, you need to fill out a medical form, and that will be a series of yes or no questions. And if you answer yes to any of the questions, it will normally direct you to either a medic or a dive medic. And dive medics questions normally people that have things like asthma or epilepsy or diabetes. Please don't panic if you get directed to a medic. It's there for your own safety. And on the extremely rare occasion that they say maybe diving isn't the best thing for you, you can still take part in the reef ecology course via snorkeling. So you're not going to miss out regardless of whichever option it is you pick. I'm a diver, but don't tell the dive team. I actually prefer snorkeling. So, and you sometimes see it a little bit more while you're snorkeling, I feel, than when you're diving. The other question I get asked as well is about the route in. So most of the routes into Honduras, as Dan said, will be via the United States. We've got a fair number of groups going via Miami this year, but the year before that it was all via Houston. So it kind of depends on the availability of the airlines. You guys will probably be Jersey to London, London over to the States, and then down to San Pedro Sula. The other thing I wanted to just talk about briefly is fundraising. So Dan touched on it very sort of very briefly, but we do also have a full fundraising team that will be able to help anybody that wants to take part in those sorts of events. So we can arrange a meeting for anybody interested in doing that once we know what the group is. So we had a question regarding, do you need an ESTA for the United States? And yes, you would. You would need an ESTA to transit. And normally, if you are a UK national, you can apply for one online before you go. And it costs, I think the last time I looked, it was about $15. You might want to check that. I know that they changed the price a couple, sort of every couple of years. And you need to do that in advance. And as a side note, anybody that has a US passport, if you're a dual national, you'll need to travel on your US passport. I've had another question. Will there be a list of vaccinations needed? So yes, we do have a list of recommended vaccinations. Operation Wallacea doesn't have a medical license, so you will always need to go and speak to your travel nurse or doctor. But you will need to ensure that you are up to date with any course of vaccines as you would have on Jersey. So things like tetanus, typhoid, I think it's the Hep A, I think it is, measles, mumps, rubellas, and that sort of thing. The other one that I get asked a lot about is, do you need a COVID vaccination? Now, a lot of places have relaxed their COVID vaccination rules at the moment. But having said that, if a country that you are visiting or that you're transiting through requires you to have that vaccine in order for you to get in and move through it, then yes, you would need to have it. And then the other thing as well is just to bear in mind that you're going to remote areas that the local population may not have the same access to healthcare as you might have. So just bear that in mind when you're making the decision about whether you're getting that vaccine or not. The other question that I get asked is it a high altitude? So I think the highest altitude of the camp is around 3,000 meters above sea level. So it's cloud forest, so it is slightly mountainous. Well, I say slightly. It is. There's a gradient there. So go hill walking before you go. But as somebody that went there, I'd never had a problem with anything like altitude sickness. I think the most issues that we had relating to sort of medical situations involved insect bites actually, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think the highest camp is around sort of just around sort of the 3,000 meters mark.
I just thought I'd pitch in there as well. In terms of the vaccinations and kit lists and everything that students will need, I will spend time going through with them, sending you letters home with kit lists, giving you suggestions about what types of stuff you will need, because Up Wallacea does put out a very good list that kind of gives you a really good understanding of what you might need. But vaccinations, if you decide that you are going to dive and need a dive medic, I can let you know of the dive medics that are available here on Jersey and warn you to make appointments early in advance and not to leave it to last minute. But it's definitely worth. I know in the past we've had a couple of students go, well, I'm just not going to mark that I'm asthmatic because I don't want to have to go see a dive medic. That's the worst thing you can do. I am an asthmatic and I'm a diver. So it's not a case of if you have asthma, you can't dive. And even in our latest expedition to Croatia, we had a student that had quite severe asthma and was quite easily able to dive after seeing a dive medic. And as long as it's managed and under control, like Helen said, it's not a case of you not being able to dive. And you usually do spend time doing both snorkeling and diving. And we find that there's quite a few instances where the divers decide that they actually preferred snorkeling because they can see more. Being above, you get a much wider view. So it's kind of a combination of the two. And you can pick and choose. So if you think, well, today I don't want to dive, I just want to snorkel, you can. So you're not, even if you spend the entire time doing a dive, it doesn't really matter. There's a question from Sarah. Yeah, it is open to current year 11s and 12s, just because the current year 12s obviously are not having a JCG expedition because it was the Namibia one as well. After discussions with Mr. Howarth about what we would do in the event that it is oversubscribed, we would look at putting like grouping people, and Mr. Howarth would make that decision along with Mr. Merritt and myself, like grouping people into groups with priority placements. How we're going to decide that, I don't know. That will come to that bridge, but we will make it as fair as possible. Worst case scenario, names in a hat, but I mean, in the past, we've managed to get everybody that wanted to go on the expedition onto the expedition. So I wanted to put that out there as a just in case, but hopefully that won't come to that.
Just leave it another couple of minutes. Hopefully you're all completely dazzled and excited to go on the trip. I've seen this presentation a few times now, and I always come away thinking, gosh, I'd love to go back to Honduras. It really is a special place, really, really beautiful landscape. It's a bit like going into a fairy tale with all of the moss and the ferns and rocks and streams everywhere in Casuco. One thing I would say as well is that if you have the opportunity to practice going up and down some hills, do so, because it will benefit you, particularly in a place like Honduras where there's quite a lot of uphill and downhill. So yes, I don't know if we've got any more questions coming in, so we will close it up there. So if, as Sandra said, there'll be a letter sent out tomorrow which will detail on how you can pay your deposit for the trip, and then following on from that, they'll be sending us a list of the students, and then you'll be getting your invoices issued by Operation Wallacea, sort of subsequent payments. If you have any questions at all, if you're a little bit like me and you think of all of your questions after you hang up the call, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. If I'm going to pop my email in the chat box, so anybody who is interested has it. But similarly, please do communicate with the school, and anything that they can't answer, they'll direct to me. So thank you very much for your time this evening, everyone. I hope that, as Dan said, we get to see you in Honduras. Thank you very much for coming along this evening.